about a theme that is discussed near the end of the chapter, which is that DNA, or the universality of DNA and the genetic code, provides strong evidence that all life on planet Earth are related and they're all descended from a common ancestor, which is a key idea in evolution. And evolution is a is the framework for the understanding of the unity and diversity of life. It's like an essential idea in biology. And so what we're showing here is a phylogenetic tree. And this is of all life on Earth. And so you can kind of divide all life on Earth into bacteria, the archaebacteria, which are the prokaryotes, and the eukaryotes, or the organisms with nuclei. And so let's see here. We can see if we can try to we can find the animals. Oh, here they are. So we've got the animals. They're actually closely related to the fungi. We've got the amoeba. We've got the plants over here in green. We've got the red algae. And you might be asking yourself, well, how is it that these trees were actually drawn? These trees weren't drawn from comparing, say, morphological traits or the external, traits of organisms, but by sequencing their DNA and then comparing the differences in DNA. You see, over the evolutionary history of organisms, mutations accumulate, and sometimes those mutations are so numerous that they result in very different traits in an organism, and organisms can no longer, interbreed. So then they become different species at that time. Of course, natural selection is playing a big role in actually causing these processes to occur. The selection of mutations over the generations. But anyway, but you can actually see the divergence of organisms into over time by looking at their DNA. And so these trees are actually drawn by comparing the DNA of these groups of organisms. And so I talked a little bit about this in our orientation session, wherein I talked about how the science of genetics is revolutionizing basic biology. So anyway, one of the big, I guess you'd call it, items of evidence that suggests that all life on planet Earth is related, has a common origin, and descended from a common ancestor is the universality of the genetic code. And we'll talk about the genetic code a little bit later, but the idea behind the genetic code here is that you can take the information in RNA and it's translated into a protein. And the way that that's done, and I'll zoom in so you can see one of these things. Like, for instance, the codon UCA in RNA is translated into the amino acid serine. Serine is always inserted when you have UCA in your messenger RNA. This is universal from bacteria to jaguars to orchids to every type of mushroom, every type of protozoa. Okay, now one of the most exciting things about studying this science of genetics in the 21st century is that we have the ability now to rapidly determine the base sequence of entire organisms, and that's called genome, this total genetic information in an organism. And so a bunch of organisms have been sequenced. This particular table shows that bacteria, yeast, a nematode, which is like a little soil worm, a little roundworm, fruit fly, a mouse, and a human being, that their genomes have been sequenced. And as we can see here, that the genome size increases as we move from sort of simpler unicellular organisms to simple animals to arthropods and then to mammals. And the number of genes also goes up. But this number here, 30,000 genes in a mouse and a human, this actually was kind of surprising. It was thought that humans were a lot more complicated than mice. I mean, we got bigger brains, we can talk, etc. But one of the surprising discoveries is that there wasn't, say, 100,000 genes as was expected for humans. There are only about 30,000. So we take a relatively few number of genes and we can generate a lot of different types of proteins. And we see that organisms that have similar genomes also share a number of proteins in these protein families. So the idea here is that not only is the DNA very similar among organisms, but all the molecules that are produced are very similar among organisms. And in this way, there's kind of a unity of life. And this is actually very helpful in the science of biotechnology, or like I should say, and medical research, because we're able to use mice to simulate human beings. The physiology of mice is very similar. They respond to drugs in much the same way as we do. They have the same genes, and so you can use mice in the laboratory. You can do things like you can knock out one of their genes, make it ineffective, and so you can see then what the effect is in the phenotype. And you can do a lot of research on mice that gives you great insight into the way that humans work. So that's a good thing, and it's improving human health, and it will for quite a while. All right, that concludes the major ideas in Chapter 1 of your textbook. Be sure to just email me if you have any questions.